Let's move on to Ukraine. Lots going on. We brought you the news previously that President Zelensky wanted to visit Israel in a, quote, show of support. Some might interpret it that way. Others might interpret it as a way to keep his name in the headlines and to make sure that the world doesn't forget about him. Well, it turns out in Israel, they read it the latter way. Let's put this up there on the screen. Israel has turned down Zelensky's request to make a, quote, solidarity visit. It's just not the right time right now. Ukraine's leader was interested in joining Anthony Blinken on his Israel visit last week. Once again, the arrogance to think that Ukraine, a nation which has no industry of its own at this point, which has no money of its own, no weapons, no ammunition, should accompany the United States Secretary of State to Israel to try and broker peace. That is outrageous. What do you have to say about what's going on in Israel? What are your relations or whatever it comes to the Egyptians or the Jordan or any of this? This is not a role for a nation who is allegedly, in the fight of its life for an existential threat. Why don't you bother yourself with that? But the reason why he's bothering himself or even trying to insert himself in all of this is specifically because he understands that Israel has directly now drawn international attention, but most importantly, Western attention from what is going on inside of Ukraine. And I've actually been thinking a lot about this, and I don't want this to sound too nasty, but a lot of liberals over the last 2 years have been trying to make the case that, the fight for Ukraine is about democracy. The fight for Ukraine is bigger than us. It's like the most important thing going on in the world. And look how quickly, Krystal, they have completely switched over to becoming Israel-Palestine experts. How quickly their attention has turned. And here's the truth that I think people in Ukraine should understand. They never really cared about you. It was all part of a bizarre psychodrama that they were happening in their own heads, play-acting war online by putting a Ukraine flag in their bio, and taking a revenge on Vladimir Putin for Russiagate. And the moment that their attention goes away, it's fickle. People have found out many times how fickle the interests of upper middle-class liberals are. And I think it's actually unfortunate. Those of us, people like me who opposed Ukraine aid from the beginning, at least I was honest about what I thought about the conflict. We were honest about the stakes. We were honest that we could feel bad for you, but we should prioritize our own interests. We at least did not deceive you that you were the most important things. And, it's probably very hard to digest for people inside Kiev because they have been, or Kyiv, I apologize, for people, they've been led to believe that Americans and many, the government and all those truly, thought this was the most important thing, when the truth is it was just, the current thing of the time. I think that's probably very painful. But let's be honest here about what's going on.
I mean, I have a much more charitable take in terms of the people themselves and their care and concern for Ukrainians, because to me, it's much more about the groups that the media and the government choose to provide humanity to, choose to center in their suffering. Unfortunately, there is a lot of suffering going on around the world. We always talked about this with regard to the war in Yemen.
Yes.
That suffering, which was the worst humanitarian crisis on the entire planet. You didn't see people with Yemen flags, not because they, hate Yemen or don't care. It wasn't put on the news.
Yeah, they just don't know anything about it.
You didn't see those people. They were invisibilized, intentionally so, because it was inconvenient for us with regard to our relationship with our big ally, Saudi Arabia. And so the Ukrainians were given, allowed to have their suffering centered and their humanity featured. And, Americans felt an outpouring of, desire to help them. And that was genuine. And you see the same thing with Israel, where, the Israelis who suffered truly this horrific atrocity, which has shaken their, sense of safety and stability and their view of the world and, the conflict in their own region, has shaken it to the core, and this horrific loss of human life. And, that humanity is featured and centered, and people care greatly about it, really genuinely care deeply about it. But the lives of the Palestinians over many years have been, really invisibilized. Now we're seeing a few images coming out as you see this, the siege taking place, the indiscriminate bombing. You have a little bit of reporting on that, but it pales in comparison to the way that the suffering of the Israelis is treated and has been completely invisible over many years as they've been, dealing with violence from Jewish settlers, the occupation of their land, the illegal settlements, the blockade that has turned Gaza into, just a truly, miserable place where 50% of people are unemployed and most overwhelmingly live on poverty and rely on international aid and all of that. So, this is actually a point I have to say Vivek has been making about which tragedies the media convinces us to care about. The perfect example is Afghanistan.
Yes.
Right? At times, we're told we care about it, the women and girls, and when Biden's withdrawing, and we're so worried about their future. And then once we're gone, it's just over. And as the American government has denied, Afghanistan, this isn't the whole of the problem, but denied them some of their own money to help deal with a horrific, collapsing economy, et cetera. Well, now we don't care about that suffering anymore. It's invisible. So
that's why
these things are a real choice in terms of the coverage and whose humanity is featured and who is allowed to receive sympathy of the American people.
But that's why I'm not as charitable, Krystal, because I saw it with Afghanistan and we saw it with Ukraine. And this is the other thing. What's more cruel, to convince somebody that you truly support them and then immediately just turn your back on them and just pretend that all the last things that you never said, or to look them straight in the face even when it's uncomfortable and be like, listen, I'm sorry, live in the real world. I mean, there's a great line from Moneyball, would you rather have a bullet to the chest or bullet to the head or 5 to the chest and bleed out? And that, to me, is just a really gross and sick way of heroizing them and thinking them that you're going to be there for them forever when A, that's not politically tenable and not realistic, but B, you're just going to switch immediately. All of Washington is completely looked away. I mean, Russia could, I don't even know what they could do right now in Ukraine. And let's be honest, Congress and all these other people with Ukraine flags and lapel pins and all this stuff, they're not going to do anything because they're focused on Israel. I just think that that's more disgusting. Like you said about women and girls. Yes, look, it's abhorrent what the Taliban does to women and girls in Afghanistan. My position from the day one is that's Afghanistan's problem. As much as it makes me sad, was never going to BS the Afghan women or the Afghan NGOs or any of that we're willing to send American troops to fight and die in order to secure their place in school. Sorry, it's not worth it.
Well, but here's the other thing, is we made things so much worse for the women and girls over our Middle Eastern adventures and attempts at completely failed hubristic attempts at democracy building. So there also needs to be a lot of humility about what we're actually able to accomplish and what works and what is a complete dramatic failure. There's also been just, incredible in-your-face hypocrisy with regard to how Russian war crimes are viewed versus how Israeli war crimes are viewed. These are so blatant that even Jake Tapper over at CNN took note and was pressing National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on. But take a listen to how Tony Blinken was talking about Russia when they were messing with the energy, messing with the electricity. Take a listen.
Heat, water, electricity for children, for the elderly, for the sick. These are President Putin's new targets. He's hitting them hard. This brutalization of Ukraine's people is barbaric.
Haven't really heard that when it comes to Israel turning off the electricity and weaponizing it and collective punishment, et cetera. He wasn't the only one. Put this up on the screen. This is from Ursula von der Leyen, who's the head of the EU. She says Russia's attacks against civilian infrastructure, especially electricity, are war crimes, cutting off men, women, children of water, electricity, and heating. With winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such. Again, suddenly when it's Israel and it's America's ally, we don't hear quite the same language with this regard.
Yeah, and that's why it just annoyed me the entire time. Autocracy, democracy, this and that, and high ideals. America is a nation like any others. We should look out for our interests. Sometimes that requires dealing with horrible people. Well, sometimes better off than the alternative. See my past comments about Saddam Hussein or other stable regimes. You can either choose to operate that way, Or you can operate purely from a realm of international humanitarian rights, international human rights and, of the laws of war and all this other. Personally, I just think that's stupid. I don't think that that's realistic. It's too idealistic. It's not possible. And so we should just forget, trying to operate this way. And instead, though, we try to have it both ways, where we're best friends with Saudi Arabia and, we'll sit by and we'll co-sign some of what's going on here, but then use it as a rhetorical weapon against people who are our alleged enemies. And then, by the way, you think they don't know this in Moscow? I used to talk, Krystal, with some people who would have bilateral meetings with the North Koreans, and they'd be like, hey, just give up the nukes. We're not, it's all good. And they would just look at us and be like, that's what you told Gaddafi. Why should we believe you? Can you blame them?
Yeah.
How can you blame them? Or for example, sometimes I knew a guy once who would sit across from very, very high level Chinese diplomats. And every time he would try and bring up Taiwan or the rules-based order or any of that, they would smirk at him. And they would just say, how did that work out for Iraq? The same thing happened. There was a bilateral meeting with President Bush, I believe, and Putin in Moscow, or it was somewhere in the world. And Bush was bringing up democracy. He's like, you should have more democracy in your country. And Putin laughed at him. And he said, we don't want the type of democracy that you have given as a gift to Iraq. It's like, we can have it two ways. We can have it one way or we can have it the other way. But otherwise, we just look like complete and total hypocrites. Which is why it bothers me so much that we continue to use this when it's convenient and then we forget it whenever it's not.
And it's so hypocritical when we try. You've got this whole genre of very highly paid and famous journalists in DC who do the whole international rules-based order dance when it suits them on Ukraine. And now suddenly they don't have much to say about the international rules-based order when it comes to Israel and what they're doing in Gaza right now. So yeah, like either actually be consistent and actually hold even your friends and your allies to a certain standard, actually believe in the international rules-based order, actually uphold it yourself in your own actions abroad, which we have really never done, or be honest about your interests, what you're doing, why you're doing it, but spare me this BS about you care so much about the Afghan women and girls, you care that Ukraine is a fight for democracy in the civilized world, et cetera, et cetera. That's not why you're doing what you're doing, so cut the bullshit.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.